For more on the war situation, a visiting professor from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, at the George Mitchell Peace Institute at Queen's University, Belfast, Darren Q, joins me now. Good to have you join us.
Thanks for having me back.
So Ukraine seems to be losing grounds on the battlefield. It also just experienced one of its worst defeats in the city of Avdiivka. What's your assessment of the war in the last 2 years? And has Ukraine's counteroffensive measures since the last year produced any tangible results?
Yeah, I think we have to sort of distinguish between the tactical picture and the strategic picture here. And the tactical picture, yes, it certainly seems like Russia is on the offensive at the moment and seems to be making some gains in 4 or 5 different locations across the front lines. But from a strategic perspective, over the last 2 years, I think clearly if you look at Russia's strategic goals, very few of those have been met, whereas on Ukraine's side, the ledger is certainly looking good, particularly in terms of simply the fact that Ukraine still survives. It is standing. It has managed to roll back the initial offensive of the Russians. The Russians were clearly incensed by the possibilities of Ukraine joining NATO. That was not a possibility in the past, but now because of this war, as you mentioned earlier, Ukraine is up for European Union membership, and there is a possibility now of Ukraine joining NATO, although I think the West still knows how inflammatory that would be. But it's not within it's not outside the realm of the possible that Ukraine could be offered NATO membership the longer that this rolls forward. I think looking at over the bigger picture, certainly Ukraine is looking good. The big question will be how much sort of progress can the current Russian offensive make? It doesn't seem likely that it's going to get too far. There could be a breakthrough, but the Ukrainians are certainly very much ready for this. And I think a continuation of the stalemate is a far more likely outcome, which gets us into the longer term picture. And a lot of this will then revolve around the American elections this fall.
And let's talk about the financing of this war. According to Kiel Institute, Ukraine has received over $100 billion in support for its defense against Russia. But the UK economy is now in recession. Money needed from the United States is stuck. How long can Europe and the US practically sustain such draining financial support for Ukraine?
I think a lot will depend upon the battlefield situation, but I do think that the Europeans and the West can continue and will continue some level of support for Ukraine. There's no doubt that European capitals are increasingly anxious about the situation with Russia. We just heard the American administration worrying about the possibility of Russians putting nuclear weapons into space. There is no lack of motivation in the West to do something about this. I think the holdup of funds for Ukraine is a temporary picture right now in the United States based on American politics, particularly around the personality of Donald Trump, who we know is very comfortable with Vladimir Putin and has expressed his admiration for Putin in the past. And this is clearly something the Russians are gambling on. If they can continue to eat away at the Ukrainian resolve, and if Trump can win the election in November, the Russians are going to be counting on American support falling further down the way. Though honestly, I think that a Trump presidency would still have to provide some sort of measure of support for the Ukraine. And I do think we're going to see the Europeans stepping up to provide additional aid in the months to come. I think the Europeans are looking with increasing anxiety at the possibility of a Trump presidency again as well. And I think they're going to be moving more quickly now to try to get assistance, especially from the Germans, the French, and I do think the British as well.
Thank you so much for your time, as always, Professor Darren Q.
Thank you for having me.